The Sony a6400. This is a camera that came out about 5 years ago. I currently own 3 of these guys. I actually had 4 at one time. Sold the 4th one to finance the a7S III, which is this camera right here. And the other a6400 is this camera right here with a Sigma 30mm f1.4. When I first got the a6400, it was actually for a camera for Twitch because I was streaming on Twitch full time essentially, and I wanted a better looking camera experience. Then I started doing multicam setups for recording music here. And in this video, I really want to talk about the strengths of the a6400 in this department. It's not a perfect camera, and it is 5 years old, and there's technically better cameras on the market right now. Except you can get a used one of these guys for pretty cheap at this point. I think like $550 or something like that. They are still selling them new as the recording of this. So I think a new one is like 750 bucks. So the price cost relative nature is actually pretty attractive from a content creation viewpoint. Also, it's in the Sony ecosystem, so any Sony E-mount lenses will work. This is a Samyang or Rokinon or whatever, 35mm f1.8 full frame, which works for this camera, the a7S III. I could put this on any of these a6400s and it will work just fine. Also on this one, I have a f4 24-70 Sony branded lens on this a6400. Again, no problem switching this lens back and forth between full frame versus APS-C, which is what these a6400s are. Now, what this will not be about is a dedicated hardcore video about photography on the a6400. Yes, I've shot photos with it, done thumbnails, etc., and it's okay for photography. The image quality is fantastic, but the ergonomics could be better. This is gonna be a videography, content creation focused video on the a6400 usage. Not a professional videographer perspective, but a content creation focused perspective with the a6400. So like I said, started out as a face cam for streaming, and then that quickly ballooned into a multicam setup for capturing multiple angles in a studio production. I started doing a lot of gear focused videos, both on the music production side and also on the gaming side. Did some work for some companies, etc., etc. But the bulk of the a6400 usage over the past few years has been in a multicam setup. And I gotta say, it's pretty fantastic in this scenario. One of the reasons is something like this with the kit lens. The kit lens is okay, by the way, but what it does excel at really well is being very light and also excellent for a top-down camera type of thing. So I actually have a few vertical mounts for cameras like the a6400 because its body size is relatively light to begin with. And then the lenses, they can get kind of heavy, but overall stuff like the 16mm Sigma and the 30mm f1.4 Sigma, which is also on that camera right there, are relatively light so they can hang from mounted situations pretty effectively without putting too much load on the whatever bars that you might have on there. When you mount things from a vertical position, there's obviously weight limits that you have to keep in mind, so always good to keep that in consideration. But anyways, I digress. Let's talk about the pros and cons of the a6400 over the past 5 years. So as it is right now, I'd say a big pro is that the cost of entry is relatively low, especially on the used market. Because yes, a Sony FX30 is clearly a better camera at this point. And if you're only gonna pick one camera and you wanna stay in the Sony APS-C type of market, then I would say the FX30 is the go-to. But you could technically buy 3 used a6400s for the same price as a new FX30 at this point. One of the reasons why I picked up several of these guys back in 2019 is because there is no record limit. There is an overheating message that can happen, but as long as you put it into a mode that accepts higher heat for longer record times, it has no problem recording basically 24p or 30p at 4K in S-Log2, which looks great. It is 8-bit footage. And yes, 8-bit is not as nice. It has less flexibility when it comes to color grading, so you do have to get things right in the camera more so than not when it comes to 8-bit versus 10-bit footage. But I'll be honest with you, I put a lot of time and thought into the whole 10-bit versus 8-bit. And at the end of the day, when you're making content, whether it be for social media or like YouTube, it's not gonna matter that much. I'm gonna put a big asterisk here. If you are a videographer that's looking for the cleanest, best possible picture, obviously 10-bit footage is gonna be better. Clearly. This Sony a7S III looks fantastic, and these a6400s definitely do not produce the same image or the image quality, but they're not far off. For instance, looking at this camera, it's a great picture. And again, 30mm Sigma f1.4 versus this is a Tamron 17-28 that this is on with a f2.8. So the actual image quality is going to be slightly better on the full frame cameras, and the 10-bit footage, again, slightly better than the 8-bit footage. But really what it affords you is a bit more flexibility in post. So you can adjust the colors and push them a bit more. If you're just starting out and you're wondering if you need 8-bit versus 10-bit, you don't need 10-bit. If you want to specifically make films, you know, or art projects, then it might actually be worth looking for that 10-bit footage. But again, the cost is going to go up, and your next best option in the Sony market right here, in my opinion, is that FX30. So moving on to more pros and cons with this guy. Again, S-Log2 actually is pretty usable. I know a lot of people were talking about issues with the color transition or color blotchiness of stuff. But I found as soon as I switched to DaVinci Resolve and I let DaVinci Resolve manage the color, so basically I say DaVinci manage the color, and when I import Sony footage, whether it's S-Log3 or S-Log2, I tell it that, I say what type of input color science, and the Blackmagic color science transfers it perfectly, and I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm gonna have a problem with using S-Log2 on the camera. Now, if this is the first time you've heard S-Log2 or S-Log3, don't worry, it's just a color profile for the footage. So when the program you use, whether it be Final Cut or DaVinci Resolve or whatever, can convert the colors to the proper colors. So if you're unaware of this stuff, it would be wise to get yourself a little educated in this department because it does pay off a lot down the road when you understand these things. But I basically exclusively shoot in log profiles and let DaVinci Resolve handle the rest because it's super easy at that point. What's really nice about this is you have a lot of upgrade possibilities for when it comes to lenses. There's lots of third-party lens manufacturers, from Sigma, Tamron, Rokinon, Samyang, all that stuff. You have a lot of options out there for building a lens kit, essentially, that can grow with the a6400 and beyond. And by the way, I do have a lot of different camera brands. Not intentionally, just ended up working that way because I was curious about lots of different formats, from Micro Four Thirds formats all the way to the Panasonic S5, which is recording above. So I'm not exclusive to Sony in any way whatsoever. I just happened to buy into the a6400 and it turned out to be a great purchase overall. Autofocus tends to be really good with these cameras as well. A7S III right here, very nice autofocus, but this camera's $3,500. Whereas the autofocus on a6400 is pretty close. It's not the same, but to the average content creator, I don't think you're really gonna notice a difference. You'd probably notice it more in the photography department. But in terms of stationary camera video, the autofocus pretty much has never failed me. And again, I've shot with at least one a6400 for once a week for 5 years at least, bare minimum. Back in 2019 when these came out, this screen flip deal right here was actually a pretty big deal. You know, it's nice, but it's not like the current generation where they pop out to the side and twist around. So, or fully articulating, I think that's what it's called. It's nice that you do have this type of thing because that's what I'm using with this camera, so I can see that it's recording and I'm in focus and that type of stuff. So let's talk about some negatives because obviously you're gonna have negatives with this type of price trade-off. One of the biggest ones is rolling shutter. The rolling shutter is terrible. If you don't know what rolling shutter is, basically when you pan a camera fast, straight lines will start bending. And the more rolling shutter, the more aggressive those bends look. The rolling shutter is so bad that I would not recommend this for any kind of vlog situation. There's also no IBIS, which is in-body image stabilization. None of that is inside the a6400. The next step up, the a6600 does have IBIS, but it is not good. Generally speaking, Sony stabilization in body of the camera has been behind. And even this a7S III, it's definitely not the best. Panasonic is incredible in this department. Even with the regular Panasonic S5, that thing absolutely crushes image stabilization. But back to the 6400 here, there is no in-body stabilization, so any kind of handheld stuff like this is going to have a lot of shakes. And any of the shakes like this can highlight that wobble pretty aggressively. The kit lens does have optical steadying right here. Optical Steady Shot is the official name, OSS. But I'm gonna be fully honest with you, any handheld shots I've done with the a6400 have not really been usable. This thing excels at being on a tripod, whether it's stationary like this or an actual video tripod with a fluid head. It works out pretty good with that. Again, any quick pans or any jitters emphasize the rolling shutter pretty aggressively, which makes the footage questionable. You can definitely get by with it, and I've seen people vlogging with the a6400. It's just your mileage is definitely gonna vary on the quality that you get out of it, because the image is fantastic. The a6400 4K quality, beautiful image. But when it comes to stabilization, non-existent, and the lenses don't really help that much. Some people might be like, oh, we'll get a gimbal. If you get a gimbal, then you have to deal with the gimbal every single time you want to load it up and do a shot like that. And that's exactly what I did when I first got this. I was like, oh, that handheld footage is pretty rough. I'll spend 500 bucks on a gimbal. I used it for a couple months, and after that, I was like, I'm just not using this gimbal. It's a pain in the ass. That's a me problem. That's not a you problem. You might be fine with loading up a gimbal every single time. But for me, I found it annoying to have to do that every time I wanted a semi-steady shot of moving things around. And plus you have to learn how to use a gimbal, like the way it moves and sways. So I don't think that's a really good answer, especially for someone that's looking to get into content creation. Oh, just get a gimbal for your a6400. It's like, at that point, get a different camera. The other issue with vlogging is the batteries suck. What I've done in a studio environment is I've gotten dummy batteries. So you can get these off of Amazon. In fact, I'll leave a link below for the ones I use. But these have been good for 5 years, essentially. I have 3 of these, and it's currently powering this camera right now. That's basically been my battery solution. I actually have probably 15 of these. Initially, I was thinking I was gonna have a bunch to rotate through in case I need to swap batteries mid-recording or something like that. But yeah, the battery's bad, but in a studio environment, it's no problem. Because again, you can set this guy up in a corner and be like, this camera lives here now. This one in particular lives as a second vertical shot in this office. And this one has been doing vertical shot duties in the other office. And then this a6400 has been my B cam for face shots. Obviously, if I need to use them for something else, I'd grab them and set them up accordingly. But generally speaking, as like a dedicated studio content creation camera, I feel like it checks the boxes off really well. The low light's decent on it as well. It's obviously not as good as a7S III, but in terms of beating a cell phone or even like Micro Four Thirds cameras, it's definitely gonna be better low light when you bump up the ISO. Another con on this is the menu system is that old style, this guy right here. It's kind of a pain in the ass. But again, once the color profiles are set up, I pretty much just stick with a few settings and work from there. You also have this function button right here, which can then set things like color balance and focus and that type of stuff. Also, another con is if you want a really wide shot, like for instance, this shot, 17 millimeters, you have to get APS-C equivalent lenses, which means you need to buy a special lens for that specifically. I think it's 10 to 18 millimeter. So if you want that ultra wide shot, you will have to get a lens that only works with APS-C for that instance, meaning that you won't be able to transfer that over to a full frame camera and get an ultra wide. You might be thinking the Sigma, the 16 millimeter Sigma is an ultra wide. Once you convert it, it basically becomes 24 millimeters, which would be like so. This is 24 millimeters. So this is like the widest you can get with these type of cameras at 16 millimeters versus 17 millimeter on this Tamron, which I believe I'd have to get like 11 millimeters on here for the same equivalence. So something to keep in mind, if you do want to have ultra wide, you will have to spend a bit more specific money for a lens like that. Lastly, there is the micro HDMI, and there's also no headphone output. So those are a bit of a knock on this type of camera. But again, if you're treating it like a content creator, not a videographer specifically, I think it's fine personally. In fact, the way I've been using all these is with time code. So I've been putting the time code into those mic jacks. And then the time code gets printed to the audio file. And then in DaVinci Resolve, I read the time code and then have all the cameras sync up correctly. And honestly, it's pretty awesome. But yeah, after 5 years, I am still using these cameras and I don't see any end in it particularly. I have never had them overheat either. And the battery solution with this has been exceptional. Yeah, what more can I say? S-Log 2 has been fine. Haven't had any real issues with that as long as I get just a decent exposure on there. I did mention earlier, but if you are planning on getting maybe something a bit better, that FX30 really is amazing. Or maybe the A7C Mark II. I don't have any personal experience with that one. The A7S III here is an amazing camera, but it's very expensive. And that expensive cost kind of makes you nervous if you bring it out in public. I have done some vlogs with the A7S III, and in the back of my head, I'm like, I'm carrying around 5 grand. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you appreciate this content, a like and subscribe goes a long way. And if you are planning on picking up an a6400, I will leave some links below. I get a small commission for affiliate sales. I will also link all the lenses that I have here, so you can check them out if you are curious. But thank you so much for watching, I do appreciate it, and I'll see you next time for another video. Peace.